these bits. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's event on Gurharpal Singh and Giorgio Shani's new book, Sikh Nationalism. My name is David Landon Cole. I'm the coordinator here at ASEN. Before we start, just a couple of quick announcements. Firstly, registration is open for this year's ASEN conference on nationalism and media, which is being held in Antwerp, and we have a 10% early bird discount until the end of February. All the info you need is on the conference website at www.nationalismand.media. We're also running our first ever summer school this year. Indeed, we're running it in the summer, and it's on nations and nationalism in the contemporary world. We're holding it in Zadar in Croatia. Confirmed speakers include Marko Antoncic, Sasha Bozic, Miguel Centeno, Leah David, John Fox, Jonathan Hearn, Deborah Capel, Simona Kuti, Gizim Krasniki, Sinisha Malisevich, Michael Skay, and Srdjan Vucetic. All the info you need for that is at asen.ac.uk/summer school, or if you just go to our website, asen.ac.uk. So that's enough announcements, and on to what we're here for. I should start by saying that this is a new time for us. It's 9 in the morning here in the UK. In the past, we've been running things in the evening in the UK time, so we'd love to know if this is a good time for you to attend our events, so do let us know. Drawing on Anthony D. Smith's theory of ethno-symbolism, the book, Sikh Nationalism, uses a new integrated methodology to understand how modern Sikh nationalism focusing on the importance of studying Sikh nationalism from the perspective of nation-building projects in India and Pakistan. Reviews have called it magisterial, exciting, provocative, elegantly written, and it is available now, published by Cambridge University Press. And I'll just quickly introduce our panel. We have Gurharpal Singh, who is the Emeritus Professor of Sikh and Punjab Studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London, where he also served as Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Humanities. His previous publications include The Partition of India, Sikhs in Britain, The Making of a Community, and Ethnic Conflict in India, a case study of Punjab. Giorgio Shani is Professor and Chair of the Department of Politics and International Studies at International Christian University in Japan. He's the author of Religion, Identity and Human Security and Sikh Nationalism and Identity in a Global Age. And he currently chairs the Politics Research Committee at the International Political Studies Association. John Hutchinson is Vice President of ASEN and Editor-in-Chief of one of our two journals, Nations and Nationalism, as well as Visiting Senior Fellow in the LSE's Department of Government, with 11 books published, and I believe the 12th on the way. At least according to your bio, John. We have Atsuko Ichijo, who is Associate Professor of Politics at Kingston University, London, and also an editor of Nations and Nationalism, as well as working with the European Commission, British Academy, UK Economic and Social Research Council, and book series editor for Paul Graves' Identities and Modernities in Europe series. And also particularly interested me is that Atsuko's writing on gastro-nationalism or food nationalism, and I think the most recent book is on the emergence of national food. And last but by no means least, we have Ian Talbot, Professor in the History of Modern South Asia at the University of Southampton, elected council member at the Royal Asiatic Society, and formerly member of the British Academy's South Asian panel and chair of the British Association for South Asian Studies. His most recent book is India and World War One, and Punjab under Raj, 1849 to 1947, was reprinted last year, I think, or the year before. So thank you all very much for coming. We really appreciate you being here. That's quite enough from me, so I will go straight in and hand over to Gurharpal Singh. Gurharpal. Oh, are you there, Gurharpal? Apparently, I'm not sure what's happened there entirely. So, in which case, Giorgio, shall we go to you?
Yeah, if that's okay, but Gurharpal, can you hear us?
How very strange. Um, I'm just sending him a message now.
Sure.
The wonders of modern technology. It's yeah,
I can
yeah,
go first if there's no problem.
yep. Let's do that.
Okay. So thank you very much, David, for the wonderful introduction to our book, Sikh Nationalism. And I'd like to thank the panelists for their time and for engaging with the book. Their work has been an inspiration to us. John's work and Ian's work and Atsuko's work in particular. I'd also like to thank Gurharpal for inviting me to his project, and I think it's very important for us to note that this was his project, this particular book. Although I have been working on the idea of Sikh nationalism for 25 years since I was a PhD student at SOAS. Let me start also by mentioning that I was primarily responsible for the theoretical framework in chapter 1 and the chapter on diaspora, and that Gurharpal wrote the most of the book, the majority of the book. Let's start perhaps by examining different narratives of Sikh identity. I should point out that what's not related, not narrated in the book is a conception of Sikhism or Sikhi as a whole. So Sikhi can be seen as a cosmology which is articulated according to 3 narratives, and the book focuses on these interrelated narratives. Firstly, Sikhism as a world religion or a panth. So Sikhs are seen as followers of Guru Nanak with a sacred scripture, the Guru Granth Sahib, and institutions, the institution of the Khalsa and the Golden Temple as a sacred space in Amritsar. Secondly, and I should point out the Sikhism as a world religion is the dominant trope or the dominant narrative for understanding Sikhism, both within the academy and the dominant narrative through which Sikhs understand themselves. However, our focus is very much on the second narrative, Sikhism as a nation or a qawm, which looks at Sikhs as a people who share a common language, Punjabi, a territorial homeland, the Punjab, and a political system which is centered on the SGP Akali Dal complex. Added to this, and this speaks directly to Gurharpal's crucial interventions, Sikhs can be seen as a minority or a diaspora. So Sikhs are seen as a religious minority in India and an ethnic minority in the West, where narratives of diaspora are strong. I don't think I have time really to go through a literature review on ethnicity and nationalism. Suffice to say that there has been an engagement with the topic of Sikh ethnicity and nationalism. This is all covered within the book. We are focusing specifically on an ethno-symbolic framework. I myself have been influenced by post-colonialism and the work of Partha Chatterjee, who looks at nationalism as a derivative discourse. But this begs the question as to what there is, if nationalism is a derivative discourse, then what, to quote Chatterjee again, does the rest of the world have to choose from if they just have to choose modular forms made available by Europe and America? What do they have left to imagine? And this perhaps is a crucial limitation of post-colonial frameworks. So within Sikh nationalism, we focus very much on the inner dimension of Sikh subjectivity, So we take the ethno-symbolist approach of Anthony Smith and John Hutchinson and other people within ASEN, which emphasizes the role of religious myths and historical memories in the nationalist narrative. So to recall Smith's work, the nation is seen as a sacred community of people devoted to the cult of authenticity and the ideals of national autonomy, unity, and identity in a historic homeland. We examine the transformation of Sikh subjectivity in the colonial period and the legacy of partition. It integrates the study of Sikh nationalism in the Punjab with that of the diaspora and offers new insights into religious and minority nationalisms in a globalizing world. So in order to stimulate perhaps discussion later, if you're reading of Smith's Chosen People, looks at ideas of myths of ethnic election, sacred territory, golden age, and sacrifice. And I think all of this is, or we think all of this is present within narratives or discourses of Sikh national identity, particularly the myth of the Khalsa, the idea of a community of the pure. So the Khalsa brings into existence the idea of a Sikh as a sovereign people chosen by the 10th Guru, Guru Gobind Singh. You have the Holy Land here of the Punjab. The Punjab is both a holy land and a homeland. It is the site, particularly of the Golden Temple complex, the Har Mandir, the Golden Temple itself, and Akil Takht, which functions at the Sikh Parliament, is the Jerusalem in a sense of the Sikh nation, the putative Sikh nation. You have the empire, the Punjabi empire of Ranjit Singh becomes Sikhified in a sense. So it becomes a Sikh empire, Ranjit Singh. The historical memories of Ranjit Singh are told back or informed back through a nationalist discourse. So the way in which Ranjit Singh's empire is remembered is crucially important in this narrative of a Sikh national identity. And you have discourses of martyrdom of the gurus and the sants, the shaheeds, which are exceptionally important, particularly when we look at the events of 1984 and the aftermath of Operation Blue Star, the way in which Sant Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale becomes inserted in the pantheon of Sikh shaheeds and martyrs. I would just like to close now, but just within the book and perhaps in the Q&A we can return to an understanding perhaps or a question whether what really the Sikh case brings to ideas of rethinking nationalism and ethnicity. And I'd like to suggest that one way of looking at this is that Sikh nationhood can be seen as embodied within the external symbols of the Khalsa rather than territorial. Consequently, Sikhs are a sovereign people irrespective of statehood in India and the diaspora. I have argued in my previous book, Sikh Nationalism and Identity in a Global Age, that the Khalsa Panth, the Sikh nation in a sense, corresponds to a deterritorialized calm or community suited to a global age. However, I think what this book does is to bring back here, the territorial, the shadow here of the Punjab, the idea that basically, perhaps in my book, that I overstated the impact of globalization on territorialized identities, and that discourses and narratives of the homeland are strong, not only within the context of the Sikh case, but globally. I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Giorgio. I think that Gurharpal, I'm hoping that your setup is working now. Can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Fantastic.
Good.
Thank you. I'm really sorry about the technical problems there.
Sure.
I should say just before I hand over to you, I was woken up last night and I thought I'll listen to an old edition of In Our Time, which was a very popular BBC Radio 4 programme, and it was an edition on Sikhism. And I thought that would be good preparation for the event. And of course, one of the speakers on In Our Time was Gurharpal Singh. So I can't think of any higher praise than that. So anyway, I'll hand over to you, Gurharpal.
Well, thank you. I think it was fortunate that Giorgio went before me, because this will reduce what I'm going to say. Firstly, thank you to John, to Ian, to Atsuko, and yourself, David, for hosting this, and of course, Giorgio, who's on the other side of the world. There is much debate today and concern about the rise of Hindu nationalism in India. This year, on the 15th of August, also marks the 75th anniversary of the independence of India and Pakistan. So the time is right, not only to reflect on the nationalisms and state-building projects of India and Pakistan in the last 3/4 of a century, but also to reflect on what the late Professor Anthony Smith called the nationalisms of small peoples who missed out: the Kashmiris, the Sikhs, the Baluchis, and the others, and what an alternative conception of South Asia might have been. So that is a broad context in which the book is placed, though it has been published not because we wanted it to be, it's purely coincidental that it's been published at this critical time. Sikh nationalism had also 3 particular specific objectives: to provide an accessible text for students and the general reader, and to locate comparatively, as Giorgio has mentioned, the Sikh case in the broader literature on ethnicity, nations, and nationalisms. And thirdly, perhaps importantly, which is directed at Sikh studies, is to start a debate, a serious debate, about the need to study Sikh nationalism in more detail. Unlike major traditions, the study of nationalism of minorities, especially complex minorities like the Sikhs and the Jews, presents special challenges to outsiders. The 26 million global Sikh community, 80% of those who live in Punjab, seem to have a distinctive and a strong identity, a high consciousness of history, a particular language, a territorial homeland, and a vibrant diaspora. Yet despite these very sharp and distinctive characteristics, the Sikhs do not easily conform to the frames of reference of ethnicity, nation, and nationalism. The issue of Sikh identity, I would argue, and many argue, is very complex, particularly at the boundaries where it shades into other identities and religions. So it cannot be addressed adequately in this short presentation. However, to keep matters simple, operationally in the book, we have used 2 main narratives of modern Sikh identity, of religion and nation. And to it, we have also added a third, both as a minority in Punjab historically, in India after 1947, and in the diaspora. We explore how these 3 narratives of nation, religion, and minority intersect, braid, and separate and influence the politics of modern Sikh formations in the 20th century largely, and today. So Giorgio has outlined our main debt to Anthony Smith and the ethno-symbolic approach, and I won't go into more detail than what he said, and no doubt others, John will have some comments. And he's also suggested how the Sikhs, as a highly symbolic community, fit in to this approach, and I have previously written about this in my own work, and as has Giorgio. In addition to the ethno-symbolic approach, we draw on 3 other dimensions which are quite important for this work and in order to build our case. Firstly, we examine how Congress and Muslim League's efforts at nation building in Punjab before 1947 And then after 1947, the Congress and the BJP's efforts impacted on Sikh minority self-consciousness as a political community. And secondly, we argue, contrary to the prevailing literature, that the Sikh diaspora is central to the development of Sikh nationalism, but it's not an independent actor, that it is both, that the Sikhs in Punjab and the diaspora are mutually dependent, sometimes less, sometimes more, but they are not shaped by the diaspora or by diasporic nationalism of the Sikhs abroad. Third, we argue, and again, drawing on our work in the rise of religious nationalism, and also the work of Mark Juergensmeyer, and again of Anthony Smith, how the unique fusion of religion and nation among the Sikhs provides something of a sacred communion, and it drives a passion and commitment of Sikhs to their homeland, to their religion, and to their nation. Some general comments about the work. It's an integrated approach, as Giorgio has mentioned, but it's also a synthesis, a reading of history and ideas, and wherever possible, as in the text aimed at students, we have sought to present alternative and competing explanations and provided a review of literature. The work draws mostly on secondary sources, but some chapters are more denser and more original, have more original sources. For example, the partition chapter, which I've written, and I've been working on a project on the partition. But we do highlight the vast areas and map out the terrain where the local and vernacular sources can further enrich our work and this kind of exercise. Finally, the work is chronological and ends in 2020, just before the global interest in the farmers' agitation movement, and we can discuss that and how it relates to the work itself. Finally, I just want to highlight some of the conclusions of the work, which I think are important. Against the prevailing consensus in Sikh studies, our argument is that the modern narratives of nationalism and Sikhs as a minority are important in the self-identification of the Sikh community. They have influenced and continue to influence the politics of Sikh formations in the homeland and in the diaspora. In the case of the Sikhs, it's possible comparatively to sketch a linear process from a small religious community in the 15th century to a distinctive ethnic group and a consciousness of a nation through a nation without a state. Interestingly, the process also works in reverse. From the mid-18th century, despite acquiring state power, Sikhism and the Sikhs collapsed into the normative order of wider Punjabi Hindu society. And arguably, since 1947, the recognition by the Indian Constitution of Sikhs as only a religious community has greatly diminished the claims to nationhood. Sikh nationalism is identity-based. The structural characteristic of the community is a very small minority in the Punjab until 1967. And its religious ethic, the open accommodation of the other and the accommodation to religious pluralism and multiculturalism makes it quite interesting from a comparative perspective. For example, the post-colonial ideal of Sikh leadership before 1947 was a religiously plural Punjab with neither Muslims or Hindus having a majority. And the call for a separate state was viewed only as an option of last resort, the logic of majoritarian religious nationalism that led to the partition. Sikhs, in short, have been always, even in 1984, the militants were reluctant separatists. As we outline in the conclusion, historically and today, Sikh nationalism is best viewed as a continuum with multiculturalism at the one end and a separate state at the other. In between, there is a vast space that is occupied by the famous Anandpur Sahib resolution of 1973, passed by the moderate Sikh Akali Dal party, which calls for, or which harks back to the cabinet mission plan of 1946, that sought to limit the power of the center, the Indian Union's center, to economy, defense, communications, and foreign affairs, more or less as a confederal state structure. Inevitably, the work also touches on the rise of Hindu nationalism and the need to interrogate Congress's secular nationalism. Importantly, the binary division between Congress's secular nationalism and Hindu nationalism, we argue, is very difficult to sustain and needs to be critically evaluated. Much earlier in the mid-90s, I argued that India perhaps ought to be interpreted or coded as an ethnic democracy. I'm pleased to see the debate is now being taken up much more seriously, for example, in the publication of Christophe Jaffrel's recent book called Modi's India. But we can discuss in Q&A the transition and the rise of Hindu nationalism and the implications of the Sikh question. Comparatively, the work also suggests, as I've mentioned earlier, that complex minorities can be analyzed and located within the literature on ethnicity, nations, and nationalism. How, for example, the Sikh diaspora has contributed to the development of multiculturalism as a public policy in countries like UK, Canada, and increasingly the US. And how also that nations without states, and looking at the Sikh case in particular, the recent development in 2019, opening a corridor across the India-Pakistan boundary line to visit for the purposes of Sikh Holy Shrine, that these nations could thrive potentially in the conditions of post-sovereignty, or alternatively, they might see a diminution in their nationness as a result of nation breaking and overt state-sponsored cultural or religious assimilation. In conclusion, I would argue that the work draws essentially on draws attention to the challenges, dilemmas, and problems of studying minorities or minority nationalisms of small peoples. And it ends with a plea to take the study of the subject of Sikh nationalism much more seriously than hitherto. Thank you.
Gurharpal, thank you. That was fantastic. Thank you very much. Let's go on to our discussants now. And we're going to go, if it's okay, with our discussants in the arbitrary order of how they appear on my screen. So we'll start with Atsuko Ichijo, then Ian Talbot, and then John Hutchinson, if that's okay with everyone. So Atsuko, I will pass it over to you.
Thank you very much, David. And again, first of all, congratulations to the Gurharpal and Giorgio on the publication of the book. I know it was a long time in making, and thank you for inviting me for this session to discuss your work, which is interesting. Okay, yes, that was a very useful introduction by two authors, and I find this work a comprehensive study of Sikh nationalism, about which I don't know much about. So I just had to confess this. And what I gathered from going through this volume is that this is a detailed study of a case of a religiously identified group gradually assuming the series of qualities of ethnic groups or nations in response to geopolitical, geohistorical, religious change. For instance, in the kind of being obviously colonialism, the rise of Westphalian system, etc. And in that sense, I was kind of vaguely wondering that yes, okay. So first of all, this it's as Gurharpal emphasized this kind of how can I say intertwined relationship with religion and ethnicity / nationalism or ethnic group and nation seems to be embodied in this case very clearly. And kind of vaguely, I was wondering if this is a similar process or development as seen in the development of two major communities in Northern Ireland, starting as kind of a nominally denominational groups, Catholics versus Protestant perhaps, but already I think marked by all sorts of other social status. But then now these two communities are not about religion, they are about, these are two ethnic communities using some kind of religious labels as for convenience. So I was kind of vaguely, lazily wondering about that, first of all. And because I'm not really well versed in the Sikh case, that kind of jumped on two dimensions. One is the idea of Sikh sovereignty, which Giorgio mentioned a few times in his presentation, and I think that's what he's interested in. And then secondly, thinking about what ethno-symbolic approach could bring by comparing Sikh nationalism, the case of Sikh nationalism, to perhaps the Kurdish one. And I just want to briefly comment on these two dimensions. Actually, it's not really comment, but a kind of raising series of questions to the authors. In terms of the idea of Sikh sovereignty, it's in the book, the authors mentioned that in order to construct Sikh tradition, that is political sovereignty, autonomy, and self-determination. This was kind of based on the myth of the Khalsa, the kingdom of the pure. And I was wondering, so this was, to start with, the process through which this idea of Sikh sovereignty, the emphasis on political sovereignty, autonomy, and self-determination have come about. And it is primarily because of the need to resist incorporation or assimilation by the Mughals. And then I was kind of start thinking about, so what's exactly the sources of this subjectivity, the idea of the Sikh are the sovereign people. And at one point it's mentioned that the book mentioned the power to self-authorize fosters radical indigenous forms of sovereignty that construct colonial contest colonial and modern Western notion of modernity and religion. And there seems to be so much there in order to think about, so what it's meant to be sovereign in this case. And I just really wanted to hear a bit more about it, because that's one of the questions I would like to see. Because and obviously the idea of sovereignty in the kind of Western tradition comes from the idea of body of Christ being the sovereign and the body of God transferred to the monarchs, and then etc. etc. But obviously it's this seems to have come through different route to come to a qualitatively similar understanding about self-determination and autonomy. And I just wonder how, and if I could hear more about this. And in addition to that, I think Giorgio mentioned very in passing Chatterjee, and in relation to Chatterjee's thesis about maintaining the sovereignty in private sphere, while not acknowledging, yes, acknowledging or acknowledging that in the public sphere it might be the colonialist or colonialism have taken hold. I just wonder how it in the Sikh case can be looked at in this sense. And secondly, in terms of the way the Sikh nationalism has been developing, and in relation to Kurdish nationalism. Why Kurdish nationalism? Because obviously the Kurds case, it's not from religion to nationalism as such. I think the religious aspect has never been an issue in the Kurdish case. However, the way being minority, has been the way the factor of being minority has impacted the development of Kurdish consciousness or Kurdish nationalism seems to be very similar or has lots of similarities with the case of Sikh nationalism. So in a Kurdish case, it was, first of all, they were under Ottoman Empire, and then as the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and with the post First World War settlement was pursued. Once, according to the Wilsonian principles, they were promised a homeland, but that was then dashed by the same system, international system, liberal order and League of Nations-based system, and then created this statelessness or entrenched statelessness of the Kurdish people. Now, this seems to be quite similarities between this the Kurdish case and the Sikh case, and when in the book, in the Sikh case, the ideas of this the having the homeland or sacredness of the people itself seems to have been very important in sustaining and developing Sikh identity. And I just wonder, especially in response to, in comparison to the Kurdish case, which is not the sacredness or religious aspect of the people may not be that emphasized. What we can say about the having kind of ethno-symbolic resources, having these resources, cultural traditions or spiritual traditions, what effect that these having these resources have to mobilize in the when the mounting resistance, etc. What effect does it have in terms of I think maintaining and keeping the minority together as a group, and especially as a group which seeks autonomy, self-determination, and sovereignty. Yes, I think that's about it. And the last question, when I was listening to Gurharpal, something just came into my mind: non-territorial autonomy. Does this have any currency in thinking about where Sikh nationalism is going? Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Atsuko. And we'll go straight on to Ian Talbot. Ian.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation to join this panel. I'm delighted to be able to do so because I've known both authors for many years and have seen the stages of intellectual development and research that have culminated in this volume. And I must certainly commend it for its empirical richness, theoretical sophistication, and also, I think, which is very important, its accessibility, because this is a very complex subject area which is being dealt with. And I think that the authors have really produced a work which is going to be accessible, certainly for students and people generally interested in the subject, as well as specialists. And I think that that's something that should be commended. I want to just very briefly reflect on three literatures which I've spent a lot of time being involved with during my career, and recent developments in those literatures which intersect with this volume. Literatures around Pakistan studies, partition studies, and Punjab studies, the three Ps. How does this volume fit within these literatures? Does it challenge them? Does it interrogate them? Does it reinforce some of the thinking in these areas? So I'll turn first to Pakistan studies because it relates perhaps to the point that Gurharpal was saying towards the end about the Kartarpur corridor issue. I mean, within Pakistan studies, there are stereotypes of Sikhs, of Sikh nationalism, and some of these just reflect on blaming almost single-handedly Sikhs for the violence in the 1947 partition, and ignore the role of the direct action movements which the Muslim League launched to try and achieve Pakistan. There's also the idea, which is picked up by many writers, that Sikhs should have thrown their lot in with Pakistan and that they would have been much better off within the Pakistan state than in an Indian state. And that reflects on some of the cultural similarities which are acknowledged, Punjabi, but also the fact that the Pakistan state would have been able, and this goes against the history of the state, but to have accepted a minority position. An issue which isn't discussed in the literature, which comes up in this volume, is of course how Sikh nationalism may fit or may be used by Pakistan to secure its own strategic interests. And this relates, of course, to the period of militancy in the 1980s and the 1990s, where despite official denials, there's clear evidence of support up to a certain level for the Khalistan movement. I don't think Pakistan wanted a Khalistan state created, but nonetheless, it wanted, as I think I put in one of my publications, to keep India on the back foot as far as Kashmir was concerned. Kashmir was really the main issue for Pakistan rather than Khalistan, but nonetheless, there was an opportunity here. And I would link this a little bit, I think, as a warning about the Kartarpur corridor issue. At one level, this could be read as Imran Khan's government, newly elected government, wanting to establish good relations with India being thwarted. This is the Pakistan official view, constantly by Modi, of course, but nonetheless wanting to establish good relations, and that this was a way of reaching out and making Punjab not the barrier between the two states of India and Pakistan, but perhaps a bridge. And that was a notion behind that perhaps, and certainly Imran Khan talked at the early days of his government, less so subsequently, about wanting civilized relations with India. However, Imran Khan, as his opponents in Pakistan are constantly saying, is a selected prime minister. He would not have come to power without the military establishment support. This is something which is very much in the news in Pakistan at the moment. He would have made no move relating to India without the military establishment's support. So it was in the interest of the military establishment that the Kartarpur corridor could go forward. If you wanted to sympathize with the Indian sort of foot dragging on this, you could say that they, from a security point of view, as well as just the ideological view of Modi, didn't want to go in for this because they were aware that this might be creating a possible opening if there's a resurgence of militancy, this corridor. And Ilyas Chatter's important book on the Punjab borderland, which reflects on the Punjab studies context for this volume, which has just been published by Cambridge University Press as well, almost simultaneously, I think, makes the point very clearly that the whole area around Dera Baba Nanak was an old established smuggling route. And this was there from the time of partition, when the idea of an iron curtain coming down is totally wrong. The border is still quite porous. And indeed, Ilyas Chatter shows the border was porous up until when the Indians started to fence it in the 1980s. So that this was a smuggling area, but the Pakistan authorities used this very region where the Kartarpur corridor is located as a means of also providing arms and support for militants during the Khalistan movement. So this is very much a case of where I'm not saying that Sikh nationalism is a proxy in the sense of Islamic proxies from the Pakistan security establishment's viewpoint, but it certainly sees some advantages in up to a point, sort of encouraging Sikh nationalism. So that's Pakistan studies and Punjab studies, certainly Ilyas Chatter's book, which I think continues a trend in terms of seeing Punjab as not necessarily experiencing a total divide at the time of partition, but of cultural links, of illicit trade, of movement of population continuing over that border, which of course, as I say, was often understood as a hard border when it's in reality much more a porous border. Partition studies has sort of, I think, brought out, and this is again the theme of the book, the complexities in recent years, the alternative prospects of India after the British leave. Obviously, with hindsight, the nation building, which Gurharpal mentioned, of Muslim League and Congress leading up to independence seems to be the only focus. There were regional identities, often in this literature called sub-nationalisms rather than nationalisms. Nationalisms of certainly Pashtuns, Tamils, as well as Punjabi Sikhs, and that these offered different visions of the future for the subcontinent than the majoritarian nationalism of both Muslim League and Congress. So that raises the issue, which is addressed in this volume, that there are other alternatives. Consociationalism, something which Gurharpal has talked about. I did a little bit of work with respect to the Punjab Unionist Party on this. There were other possibilities. Why did these other possibilities not ultimately succeed? An easy answer to this, of course, from the Sikh perspective, is that they were a minority. They had no district of the Punjab in which they formed a majority. So that was the reason. An alternative way of looking at this, of course, is a convergence of interests, certainly within Congress and the outgoing British Raj, in terms of what they wanted the transfer of power to be. The British were there to maintain long-term strategic and economic interests. They could do this by being on good terms with Indian nationalism. They certainly didn't want a balkanized subcontinent. Ironically, in a way, they're beginning to share interests with Congress. Congress was also concerned about the threat of communism as British power was being devolved, and Congress was also concerned about balkanization. And of course, there's this whole business with the Mountbatten showing his first partition plan on a hunch to Nehru, and Nehru being absolutely appalled by this because it threatened balkanization. And it was very clear in the reworking of the plan that there's going to be one partition and one partition alone, and also that Pakistan, and this of course impacts on the Sikh issue, was going to be cut down to size. That was assisted by Sikh demands also for partition, so East Punjab goes to India, but it was also assisted, ironically, by the Muslim League's own missteps in terms of, and this is something which is mentioned a little bit in the volume, but I would be fascinated for it to be developed further, how the direct action movement, which culminated in the Rawalpindi massacres, but also the direct action movement in the frontier, which badly impacted on the Sikh community there. And often the Sikh community in the Northwest frontier provinces left out of the discourse, and it's all about the Sikhs in Punjab. How these direct action movements, which the Muslim League took to achieve Pakistan, actually were perhaps the icing on the cake, if you like, of the sense for the Sikhs that there was no way that they could live in a Muslim-dominated Punjab or Muslim-dominated Pakistan. So you end up then with some writers call it the irony, I'm going to finish on this point, of the community which had the most to lose by partition, by losing the shrines, unless the boundary commission really went in a direction which was unlikely, calling for partition. And that was the outcome, but it was a response, if you like, to these direct action movements, which the Muslim League had taken. And I think that Barras makes this point in his work, which Gurharpal quotes, the partition, the creation of Pakistan was made possible by violence. And then that's an important understanding. But it also impacts on Sikh nationalism and on the prospects of the Sikh community and what they want or hope for in this situation as a minority population. I'll finish on that point.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Ian, and we'll go straight over to John Hutchinson. You are on mute, John.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks very much for inviting me to comment on this fascinating book by Giorgio and Gurharpal. And I will really focus on the book from a kind of ethno-symbolic perspective and really just raise a few questions rather than going to any real substantive analysis. But there's a really fascinating book that, as the authors and the other speakers have said, that it shows the kind of very conflicting but also complementary narratives of Sikhism as they shift from the creators and bearers of a universalist monotheistic religion open to all, and a highly particularized notion of the community based in the Punjab, which gives the basis for a possible nationalist movement in the modern world. But this nationalist movement is itself undercut by the fact that the Sikhs are a minority. So the idea of independent statehood is usually seen as a kind of utopian aspiration, which leads them into the idea of a politics of justice, in part based on the religious precepts, the notions of power sharing, and accommodation with other groups, which eventually could threaten the assimilation of the group to larger communities. So in exploring Sikh nationalism, the authors adopt an ethno-symbolic approach, that they accept, as most scholars do, that Sikh nationalism, like other nationalisms, is a product of the revolutions of modernity, political, ideological, and economic. But ethno-symbolism offers a skepticism that you cannot explain why specific nations form just through looking at these revolutions, why there are the attachments to the nation are so passionate, and also why nations persist in time despite these tremendous tumultuous changes throughout the modern period. And to that, you need to understand the starting point, the traditions from which people started, this inner symbolic world of myths, memories, symbols, and so forth. And these help form the group before modernity, and help shape the response of a given population to these great modernizing changes. And I think the book elaborates the approach very effectively. In Anthony Smith's book, there are at least two very important pre-modern factors or processes which lend to a group formation. One is religion, the idea of having a special religion. And the book charts the rise of distinctive spiritual leaders and the crystallization of institutions from the 16th century onwards, through sacred scriptures, distinct script, ritual practices and symbols, a distinctive egalitarian social vision, and temples or religious centers, which become also nubs of governance. And it also shows that while religion varies in time, and it varies in its hold on the population that get nominated as Sikhs, nevertheless it becomes a key reference point through time. And the second factor is, of course, the role of war and the experience of war, and how the dramatic events of war, the experiences of suffering, and also of great achievement or glory, imperial glory, can help cement a sense of group worth over time. So it examines the role of conflict, the early martyrdoms, the development of heroic myths of a golden age of empire, and how under colonialism the British reinforced this idea of the Sikhs as a martial race, and used the Sikhs as a means of control of the other populations of India, and the fact that the Sikhs are overrepresented in the British Army and take great pride from their achievements in the wars fought by Britain in the world wars. And so Britain reinforces this idea of a Sikh as a kind of elite martial race. And this, of course, is carried through in independence, which again emerges through conflict, and through the Sikhs not only become an important component in the Indian army, But through the pogroms and conflicts of early partition, this notion of Sikh suffering and Sikh military achievement becomes reinforced. And of course, there's finally the trauma of the destruction of the Golden Temple at Amritsar. So these two factors together, you could see as fusing the notion of the Sikhs as a special people, religiously chosen, and also a people victimized by history, but able to survive because of their indomitable martial spirit. So this enables the persistence of the community over time, despite all the great traumatic events of the loss of the dominant minority status, and the threats that occur after independence from a kind of mass majoritarian nationalism in India and Pakistan. But there are various questions I would want to raise about the ethno-symbolic approach and this analysis. And some of them are practical. How possible is it to excavate the inner symbolic world of community? Because as we know, the records that are available to historians are largely the records of an elite, of a literate group. There are, of course, practical ways in which one can come through symbolic analysis, through looking at philological evidence, through archaeology and so forth, to try and as it were, get at the mentality of groups below the elite. But the analysis also shows that the Sikhs are highly differentiated. The caste system undercuts the notions of egalitarianism. There are gender divisions, and there are different religious practices within the Sikh community. So are there multiple symbolic worlds? And also, how is the symbolic world, the Sikh symbolic world, transmitted through time generationally? And even if the same symbols are used, how does one know that the meanings have not substantially changed? Now, I think there are answers to these things, but it shows the complications for undertaking an ethno-symbolic analysis. A second question I want to raise is about the nature of the Sikh past. Anthony Smith makes a distinction between groups which are the notion of groups with empty pasts and those with full pasts. Empty pasts, there's very little material for nationalists to work on, but it gives them great scope, as it were, to invent. But the danger is that their invention will be thin gruel, as it were, will not sustain a population. On the other hand, there are full pasts, which sometimes are too full, so there are a large number of conflicting pasts, which means that there are major conflicts within the community over deciding what the identity and politics of that community should be. And it seems to be that the two traditions singled out in this book cut in different ways. The religious tradition focuses on the universalist vision of Sikhs, which can be taken up, say, by the Sikh diaspora. And the fact that it breaks with the existing caste systems. But war tends to produce exclusive identities. It hardens the idea of a group in conflict with others in an existential struggle for territory and resources. So this notion of exclusion seems to operate very, very much in tension, if not contradiction, to the kind of the universalist vision of justice. So are there particular, one of the questions that interests me is that can one find key figures who represent these different traditions? Are there points where these differences are brought out in debate and debate and argument. Do these different traditions have particular constituencies which vary from each other? And what are the circumstances under which vision takes primacy rather than another? So these are just points that, again, one can find answers in the book, but again, that provoke further thinking. A second point is the book shows very powerfully persistence, the persistence of traditions, and the capacity of these to provide a kind of survival raft for the group at times of tumultuous change. But of course, you cannot navigate the modern world unless traditions can be modified, can be developed. Too much fixity of traditions threatens the irrelevance of a group in the modern world. So the nationalists are also innovators. So how is the process of innovation carried out? Now, interestingly, the book focuses very much on religious reformists in the late 19th century as a key element in laicizing religion and democratizing religion. And there's a culture of literacy and of new educated people. Now, interestingly, to the earlier Smith, before the ethnic origins of nations, discusses precisely this, that in response to modernization, the impact of modernization of tradition, you get three specific intellectual groups forming, which also often meld into each other. One is the universalist, looking to reason, cosmopolitan visions, and so forth, of a secular kind. And you see this in the book with the communist strand of Sikhism that seems to reject, in part at least, the religious, the hold of religious custodians. Then, of course, there are traditionists who become neo-traditionists in response to the struggles of modernity. And again, these can be reflected in the major religious revivals one seeing in the contemporary world, which reject which claim that the secular solutions in modern post-colonial states have failed, and they've alienated the elites from the people. And then there are the religious reformers who, for Smith, play a crucial role in modernizing tradition, and through this modernization, a kind of nationalism is able to emerge. But of course, these religious reformers are themselves an elite group. So again, the question of how the elites relate to the masses comes back as a central issue. So again, it raises various questions about the educational structure of the community, the degree to which who has control of the key institutions, whether they're still the religious custodians or whether they're more secular groups, the extent to which there's a kind of secular public sphere. Again, that's a point raised in the book. All of these are interesting questions, I think, that could be further elaborated. And finally, there's the question of the possibility of a global Sikh community. But I think the book and Giorgio again seems to agree. The whole focus of the whole evidence of the book that the Sikhs live across key fault lines between states means that the geopolitics of states and the fate of populations within states means that the Sikhs cannot, as it were, detach themselves from a territorial identity after all. Well, thank you for listening to. These are just sort of questions I think that this very rich and fascinating book raises.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, John. I think what I'm going to do is go over to, we'll go to Gurharpal and then Giorgio to respond to Ian, Atsuko and John, if that's okay with you both, and then take questions from the audience. So if you're tuning in on Zoom, on Facebook or on YouTube and you've got questions, do please ask them in the respective chats and I will pass them on to our speakers. But with that said, if it's okay, I will pass on to Gurharpal to respond to the to everyone, and then Giorgio, and we'll do questions, and then have a sort of once round everybody, if that's okay. Gurharpal, you need to unmute.
Can I just say that these are wonderful responses, and I will have to be very, given the time, I will have to be very brief, and I hope we will have an opportunity one-to-one to discuss them and feedback much more comprehensively. Atsuko raises very pertinent questions. The shadow of Northern Ireland is all over the book in one way or another. It was inevitable because I worked to some extent closely with Brendan O'Leary, who's a specialist on Northern Ireland, and the issues relating to religion and divided societies. But more important than that is that the colonial administrators in Punjab always referred to Punjab as the Ulster of India, and the sectarian divisions in Northern Ireland was their mental frame for dealing with the communal troubles in Punjab, and they refer to the Sikhs as a Protestant sect of Hinduism. So there's quite a lot of baggage there, which can be unpacked, and we can see to what extent religion divides. Religion is really a metaphor for deeper ethnic divisions. On the question of Sikh sovereignty, I leave it to Giorgio to respond, as this is his area, except to say that we outline the different perspectives on Sikh sovereignty, the religious, the non-religious, feminist, and the postmodern. So the text that you were referring to was a text which refers to an interpretation of the sacred scriptures in terms of issues of sovereignty. As for applying the ethno-symbolic approach to the Kurds, comparing the Sikhs to the Kurds, again, a very important point. It was made by one of our reviewers, Brendan O'Leary, and we did refer, looked at the literature as far as I could, and there seemed to be remarkable similarities, which I think need to be brought out further, especially in terms of how state construction occurred after the 1920s and the Iraq War and the building of a particular kind of statehood since then. So there are important parallels and comparative dimensions which one can bring out, and especially, as you say, the cultural resources used for resistance and to keep a community together, and discussion of the notions of sovereignty and autonomy, especially, although the Sikhs are not as dispersed as the Kurds in their immediate areas of settlement. They are dispersed in the diaspora. They're outside of Pakistan. And there is the majority of the Sikhs in South Asia were probably in Afghanistan, and most of them have now left the country. Turning to Ian, it's a very rich and comprehensive survey, and I think I really haven't much to add, except that from what Ian has said, for the broader audience, it's important to recognize that the border between India and Pakistan is much more porous, has historically been much more porous since 1947, as the innovative work of Ilyas Chattar has highlighted, so that some of these issues need to be looked at in that light. And clearly we need to reflect much more on the alternatives to statehood, to decolonization in 1947, and the convergence of interests between the British state and the British in India and the Congress, which came together in a quick exit plan. But again, I don't need to go into Ian's comments much more, because he and I are in a sense collaborators. We think on the same plane, and there's not much divergence, but it was a very comprehensive review. Turning to John's comments, I think that again they're incredibly insightful, helpful, and in some ways, I wish we had some of these comments and observations before or when we were writing the book. They would have been really, really useful. But in further developing the work, I think he's hit on some of the key points of contention that we also felt when we were writing it. To what extent the division between the elite and the average Sikhs, how does one overcome that, particularly in terms of sources and vernacular sources, and how one really does understand the inner world of the past. And here, I think I would refer perhaps to the work of anthropologists, modern anthropologists, people like Joyce Pettigrew, who wrote her work in the 1990s and did pioneering research in the 1970s to highlight that despite the obvious divisions and structural gender and political divisions among the Sikhs, that there is still a great deal of commonality and cohesion within the community, which is apparent. And so the inner world element, we wanted to explore much more through vernacular sources, poetry, novels, literature, and so on and so forth. But this, this work is a work of mapping out where the state of the debate is, to follow it further through. And hopefully that will be done by future generation of scholars. I'm conscious of the time. How long have I got? Or shall I just?
I mean, to be honest, we've been going for an hour and 20, so I think we probably want to wrap up in the next 10 minutes or so. So not a huge amount of time, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I think I will end there because I want to give others an opportunity. But I have a whole, I can go on about my response to John, but I leave it to Giorgio if you want to say a few words.
Giorgio, let's pass to you.
I'll be very brief because we would really appreciate questions and feedback. I just want to thank the contributors for an excellent set of comments and a close reading of the work. I would like to just respond to two points which were made by Atsuko and by John. The first one on understandings of sovereignty, and the argument here is that in 1699, with the foundation of the Khalsa, you have a different paradigm of sovereignty in which the followers of the Guru, of Guru Gobind, are invested with the sovereignty of the Guru. So, as I suggested in an earlier iteration, this predates the French Revolution by almost 100 years. But isn't the concept of nationalism the idea of the sovereignty residing within the people? Now, this is a different conception because the people are not territorially defined. So I would say that this poses a question of embodied sovereignty. And John, thank you very much for these excellent points. The universal and the particular here would be a universal and a particular world religion, and this discourse of highly particularized discourse of ethnicity and nationhood, which comes through an engagement with colonial modernity. So really, the tradition itself, the cosmological tradition of Sikhi, changes and is transformed with this encounter with colonial modernity. And as I tried to suggest in my earlier work, also with an encounter with globalization. However, what we've seen is fractions within globalization, the emergence of disembodied globalization, the return here of the nation state. And I think one point which we make within the book is that the Sikhs are very much shaped by the world around them, by narratives of the world around them. And with this emphasis upon territorialized identities, this re-emphasis, which we're living through with COVID-19, we would expect to see, in a way, a greater resonance of these narratives of the territorial belonging. So I'll stop there, and I would like to thank the discussants for their excellent comments.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm actually going to follow up on that, if I may, with the content that's come in, which is, I think, related to what you were just talking about, Giorgio. Has the religious content of Sikhi changed in response to secular nationalist demands? Question mark. Does anybody want to jump in on that? Gurharpal, Giorgio, perhaps?
Yeah. That's a very important question, and in a way it goes back to the questions that John raised earlier. What have been the key figures or key events around which Sikhism as a religion has changed? And I didn't get time to answer that. I'm not, obviously, one such point has been the late 19th century, or what Giorgio has written about the colonial encounter. And the second one, and I think, is the partition. The impact of partition on Sikhs and Sikhism is yet to be seriously understood, but it did have an impact on the way Sikhs reflected about their lost sacred sites across the border. And thirdly, I think, post 1984. Now, there is a big debate within Sikhs and Sikh studies that the institutions and structures which were created as a result of the colonial encounter have become sterile and unreforming and unresponsive to the great social change which is occurring within the community in Punjab and in the diaspora. And what secularism did, in a way, Indian state secularism did, was push Sikhs into a corner that, they were defined only in terms of their religious identity, and it limited their public space and so forth. So in some ways it had a negative effect, and it stopped the evolution of and development of Sikhism and reform of Sikhism as a religious tradition. It is happening, however, it's happening now at the borders. It is happening with the emergence of new sects, new modern age religions, and especially among subaltern castes within the Sikh tradition, but not on the grand scale of the late 19th century.
Fascinating. Unless anybody else wants to jump in, I'll go to another question. And you're making it easy for me because you're leading straight into another question, because this is about the India-Pakistan border. The Kartarpur corridor is currently one way. I think that means you can go from India and Pakistan back, but you can't go from Pakistan to India and back. I think that's right. Is this an example of Pakistan instrumentalizing Sikh identity for its own ends in a way that India cannot because of the relative numbers on either side of the border?
It is an interesting question and interestingly posed. I wrote an article on the Gurharpal corridor when it first opened about how religious places have been divided and how both India and Pakistan have, in their various ways since 1947, have disciplined the Sikhs. Pakistan much more so through construction of physical borders, and India less so, but through state secularism. And one of the ironies of this is that in the article that I wrote, I argued that if Pakistan was genuine about religious pilgrimage, then there are minorities, for example, the Ahmadis in Pakistan, who have a religious shrine almost close to where that corridor is being created on the other side of the corridor. So one would see a two-way flow of potentially, I mean, if there were sincere intentions to increase religious pilgrimages across the border, that would be possible, but it's not. I mean, the way the Pakistan narrative of Sikh identity, as Ian has highlighted, has been constructed is very much still mirrors the partition or pre-partition ideas and narratives of the community, that they are irrelevant, small, misled by Congress, and a strategic asset. It has not evolved beyond that, despite the rhetoric of Imran Khan about Pakistan being the new homeland of the Sikhs. You know, he's gone so as far as that, and the Pakistan state, interestingly, opened the corridor to coincide with the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. You know, that was the level of symbolism. So, but in reality, as Ian has said, you know, the corridor has become is a project of the military, but a very limited project. But it has potential. I would say, you know, sometimes these things have unintended potential and consequences.
Because those are the other things. I think the corridor had been talked about for a long time before it actually happened.
Yes, it has been talked about for almost for almost 50 years. And after the Indo-Pakistan War of 1965, there were efforts to exchange territory because it's divided along the river Ravi, and the river changes course all the time. But it was felt that any breach of the Radcliffe line that divides the two countries would be a major revision. However, you know, it's a corridor of peace, but it could be a corridor of fear. And you know, so through the pandemic, it's been largely inaccessible.
Yeah. Right. I'm going to ask one last question from the chat over on Facebook. And this may be something that we actually need to have a completely different session about, but I'll open it to anyone who wants to answer. How do changes in the political situation of the Sikh homeland affect how the diaspora sees itself?
Sorry, can I give a very quick answer, because I've been provocative? Yeah. And I've always felt, and I've argued against the literature which says the diaspora is a cause of all the trouble in India. I think the diaspora is a weather vane. It reflects very quickly the winds that blow from Punjab. I leave it open to Giorgio to comment on that.
Giorgio.
Well, I would agree in that within the literature, and I think this is on the table, which I briefly showed, there is a view or a fetishization in a way of the diaspora as disconnected from the Punjab. And I think that anthropological work has shown that there are links between the Punjab and the diaspora. In this sense, I prefer to look at it as part of a continuing of a global Sikh calm, which includes both the diaspora and the Punjab. So I don't think the disjuncture is as great as has been emphasized in the literature beforehand. So I'd agree with Gurharpal.
Fantastic, thank you. Unless anybody would like to offer any last comments.
I would just like to thank everyone and say, you know, it's been a brilliant discussion, and thank you for the effort to the discussants for taking your time and reading the work so conscientiously, and to you, David, and to those listening. You know, please read the volume, and if you want another discussion, there will be a one launch at SOAS on the 2nd of March.
Oh, fantastic. If you can let me have the details for that, I'll make sure we send it out to our members as well. So I will wrap up there by saying thank you to the authors of Sikh Nationalism, Giorgio, Shani and Gurharpal Singh, and to our discussants, John Hutchinson, Atsuko Ichijo, and Ian Talbot. The book is available now, published by Cambridge University Press. And just to repeat the announcements we had at the start very quickly, registration is open for our conference at nationalism&.media, early bird discount till the end of the month. Registration for the summer school is at asen.ac.uk/summer school. Our next event is going to be in early March to coincide with International Women's Day. And I think that is everything. So I will wish you, wherever you are in the world, a very good rest of the day. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. Bye to everyone.